The Box of Delights by John Masefield, Chapter 8, Part 1. While he was looking through the letters, Ellen brought in the paper. "Oh, Master Kay," she said, "have you heard the news? The Bishop of Tatchester has disappeared." "What?" Kay said. "The papers are full of it," Ellen said. "The reverend gentleman went out of the palace last night for a brisk walk before going to bed, according to his custom, and he hasn't come back, Master Kay." Kay opened the paper. "Startling disappearance of the Bishop of Tatchester. Considerable alarm was caused," he read, "in ecclesiastical circles last night, when it was known that His Grace the Bishop of Tatchester had failed to return to the palace, and was not heard of at the time of our going to press. The very reverend gentleman had passed the evening at the palace in making ready for the Christmas season, and in dispatching his Christmas cards to the clergy of his diocese, a duty that his Grace leaves to no hands but his own. On conclusion of this pleasant duty, his Grace signified to his sister, Dame Eleanor Causible, that he would go for a brisk walk through the precincts before retiring to rest. According to her nightly custom, Dame Chasuble prepared tea for his Grace on his return. As he had not returned at the accustomed time, she proceeded to the precincts, but could not see him. At first she thought it likely that his Grace had joined some body of carol singers, and might be singing carols in the neighbourhood. But at midnight, as he had not returned, she became alarmed and telephoned to the Dean, who inquired at once at the hospital if his Grace had been a victim of some accident. But, receiving a negative response, they communicated with the police, and although an active search was at once instituted, we regret to announce there has been no news has been received of his Grace's whereabouts. It will be remembered that the palace was the scene of a serious burglary the night before last, and it is thought that the bishop's disappearance may be connected with that earlier outrage. Dame Chasuble is confident that the bishop has no enemy who would lay violent hands upon him, and flouts the opinion that he may become some subject to some sudden loss of memory. The police are inclined to view that the reverend gentleman may have received some shock, as from a passing motor car, which may have caused a temporary aberration. Anyone who may have seen anyone answering to the description of his Grace, or any occurrence which may seem to throw light onto his disappearance, is earnestly asked to communicate with New Scotland Yard, or with the Tatchester Constabulary, Tatchester 7000. Naturally, his Grace's disappearance has cast a gloom upon what would otherwise be a festival city. We would remind our readers that on Christmas Eve at midnight, his Grace hoped to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the dedication of the cathedral, for which great occasion the usual Christmas decoration and expectations have been increased 1,000-fold. We are sure that we voice the feelings of thousands of our readers when we extend to Dame Causible our heartiest sympathy in her anxiety, and our liveliest hope that his Grace may soon be restored to the bosom of his household and his diocese. Few figures in the Church of today are more eminent for piety and Christian virtues than his Grace, the Very Reverend Michael Causible, D.D. Our readers will remember that Dr. Causible in his young days was a famous oarsman, long-distance runner, cricketer, and heavyweight pugilist. In the scholastic field he carried away not only the prize for Greek verse, the Newdigate, the Latin oration, and the Ponsford Laurel Crown for Hebrew, but took first-class honours in natural science and in what are known as grades. Few people of his time at the university have attained such universal distinction in the provinces of sport and learning. "I say," Kay said to himself when he had read this, "now they've got the bishop, I won't mind betting it's the same gang, and they're after this box of delights, and they think that the bishop's got it." While he was meditating this in the dining room, Peter came down. It was about 10 minutes past 8, and being a dark winter morning, was still hardly full daylight. "You look pretty gloomy, Kay," Peter said. "I am pretty gloomy," Kay said. "They've scrobbled the bishop. I bet it's the people who scrobbled Maria." "And who do you think they are?" Peter said. "Well, I'm worried, Peter," Kay said. "I know you think it's absurd, but I think they're the missionary college people out at Chester Hills. Would you come with me, Peter," he said, "to Chester Hills, to see what kind of a place it is?" "Well, I don't mind," Peter said. "Shall we go after breakfast? I was thinking we might get there and back before breakfast," Kay said, leading the way to the door. "Breakfast won't be till 9. He paused just outside the door. It was a gloomy morning. "How on earth could we get about 40 miles and back?" Peter said. Kay got hold of Peter's arm and with his other hand twitched the button on the magic box, and instantly both of them were plucked through the air in a northwesterly direction, so swiftly that they saw the fields and the brooks in a kind of blur beneath them. Then, suddenly, they were whirled downwards, and there they were, on a hillside, standing on what was the rampart of an old camp. Both the boys were a little out of breath. "Now, this is Chester Hills," Kay said. Look there. That's Hope and Chester's, the railway station, where the curates got into the train, who I believe picked my pocket. And you can see that this was once a Roman camp. This is the Chester." "Well, where do you want to go now?" Peter said. "I think down there into that valley," Kay said. Looking down on the valley, the boys saw nothing but a great sea of woodland, which began a little way below the camp and filled all the valley. But there were folds in the valley, and what there was in the folds they could not see. "I say, it's a lovely country," Kay said. "It looks all right," Peter said. "I vote we go and explore in the woods." Kay looked first at the Roman camp. The line of the rampart was still firm and sharply cut. The gates were just as they were when the Romans had marched out of them for the last time. "Jolly good chaps, the Romans," Kay said. "Oh, I don't know," said Peter. "They were rather a mouldy lot. They were lucky chaps not to have to learn Latin grammar, but to know it naturally." "I don't know. I admire them enormously," Kay said. "You see, we are 1,000 miles from Rome, and they hadn't any trains, and they hadn't any steam, and they walked here, carrying all they wanted on their backs. And when they came to the sea, they made ships and sailed here. And when they were here, they made the only roads that we had that were any good for the next 1,800 years, and the only baths that people took until about 50 years ago. You see there, you can see from the lie of the land that the road ran out of the gateway down the hill. I'll bet if you had a spade to clear away the turf, you'd come upon a pavement underneath." He led the way down the hill, and presently the line of the Roman track became more difficult to follow. When they came to the edge of the wood, the track was barred with a lock and chained gate. There was a notice nailed to the tree, "Trespassers will be prosecuted," and on another tree there was a bigger notice, "Danger, man-traps and spring guns." The track inside the wood was hardly more than a narrow woodland path. The wood looked curiously forbidding and evil. It contained a great deal of yew and other dark evergreens. The undergrowth was curiously grown, and in the darkness and wetness, with its profuse mass of close, sinister growth, it put a chill on both boys' hearts. "Doesn't look a very cheery place," Peter said. "I don't think we ought to risk those notices." "Oh, rats," Kay said. "I don't believe in any of those notices. For years I was scared of a notice that said bloodhounds, and there wasn't a bloodhound within the county. Come along in, but we'd better not talk much, and we won't make more noise than we must." He clambered over the gate, and Peter followed. They went down the woodland track. It was a still, sinister wood, very thick covert, even for the depth of winter. As they went along, it seemed to Kay that somewhere on his left hand there was a noise of water falling, much as if he'd heard it in his dreams. The little track led down the hill. It wasn't straight, but bent and twisted. Peter went with a beating heart. Kay went forward boldly. I say, Kay, Peter said, I wish you wouldn't hurry on like this. You ought to go cautiously. It's absolutely safe, Kay said. Do look, nobody's been on this woodland track for weeks. But a keeper might come at any minute, Peter said. There aren't keepers, Kay said. You can see that this place isn't preserved. If it were preserved, we should have seen pheasants long ago. Or, if not pheasants, we'd have seen keepers, vermin boards, or dead stoats and weasels and poor beautiful owls. Presently they passed from the woodland into a rather denser part that was more like a neglected shrubbery with azaleas and overgrown rhododendrons. In this part of the wood, a very great deal of box had once been planted. They had straggled and grown to a great height and made the wood even darker than it would have otherwise been. There the track ended in a double line of box trees. No doubt the trees had once been trimmed in a box walk. Now they were all straggled and overgrown and untidy. Between the lines of box trees, however, a path that seemed to be in considerable use led to the right and left. Through gaps in the dense shrubbery, the boys saw the gleam of water just below them. That will be the lake, Kay said. It's marked on the map. Let's go down and look at the water. They left the path and thrust through the shrubbery where it seemed thinnest, and presently were just inside a rhododendron bush on the very lip of the water, which stretched to the right and left in a long and very beautiful lake of deep water. It was not much more than 100 yards across, but it gave to Kay the illusion of great depth and of being very evil. It was so dark, being fringed on both sides by beautiful trees, nearly all dark. I say, Kay said, what a place. It gives me the fantods, Peter answered. I don't like this place. Well, we've come here now, Kay said. Do let's examine it before we go. A little to the right of where they were, they saw among the trees the roof and part of the building, and what was either a boat or a bathing house. Away to the left, about 500 yards from where the lake came to an end, in some tumbled rocks and boulders. Beyond this, the ground rose with shrubberies and ornamental trees, and beyond the trees there were buildings seemingly of great extent, yellowish, Kay thought, as though built from Cotswold stone, which must have been imported there. From somewhere in the mass of these buildings, which were mainly screened by the trees, a little bell chimed gracefully for the half hour. Now, I'm going along here to have a look at this house, Kay said. You going? No, I don't think I will, thanks, Peter said. You go and look at the house if you like. I'll just go along and look at the boat house and see if one could come here in the summer for a swim. Well, do look out for yourself, Kay said. That little clock has just chimed for 8:30. When it chimes for 9, you be inside the track we came by. You can easily take cover and wait for me. All right, Peter said, but I do wish you wouldn't go into this place. You'll get dropped on most frightfully hot if they catch you. Kay went off along the path between the box trees, and he hadn't gone very far before he heard footsteps and voices coming towards him. He nimbly took cover between the path and water and listened as the voices and steps drew nearer. Presently, Kay could distinguish the voices of those who were approaching. He heard the unmistakable high voice of the foxy-faced man saying, "So, you'll get them all in the soup. Ha-ha! What?" Then something followed which Kay couldn't quite catch, but the next voice which spoke was undoubtedly that of Abner. "As to that matter, sir," Abner was saying in his silly silk voice, "that's a question that must wait until we've had our bath and our breakfast. Perhaps they'll be in a better mood and more disposed to be reasonable after their good night's rest." The men passed where Kay was hidden without seeing him. The foxy-faced man said, "It'll be mighty cold. One plunge, and then out will be enough for me." "It will be exhilarating," Abner said. "By the way, I think I shall recommend 11 for service abroad, but my head will be clearer after my bath." Kay heard the man enter the bathing box a little distance from him. He heard feet running upon the springboards and 2 splashes, followed by splutterings. The foxy-faced man was saying, "It's like iced water, what?" Kay heard them crawling up the steps from the water, and Abner saying, "Enough for honour. We will leave the rest to the British." He heard them rubbing themselves down and muttering with clacking teeth that their blood would never warm again. Soon they had their robes round them and were running back along the path by which they had come. Kay went out from his hiding place and crept along in the direction in which they had gone. Presently he came to the end of the lake among the tumbled rocks and boulders. At first he could see no outlet to the waters, but then he heard, above the sighing of the pine trees, a sort of wash of water. Somewhere underneath his feet, some water at any rate from the lake was falling into a passage underground. The path by which the bathers had come led above the tumble of rock. He followed it through a dense shrubbery and presently came to a thicket of laurel bordering on a drive. Through the laurel he could see the spacious mansion built in Cotswold stone somewhere early in the reign of George III on a foundation much older. He was looking directly across a great double front doors within a portico. They were lofty doors, paned with glass to give light to the hall within, and as the morning sun was now shining onto the glass, he could see something gleaming inside the hall. It looked like a suit of armour. The hall had the look of having been built on after the main structure had been finished. While he watched, there came from within the house the sweet banging of a gong. Almost immediately, half a dozen men wearing black cloaks came out of the outhouse to the right of the house and passed through the front doors. "That's the gang," Kay said to himself, "or some of them. This college of young clergy, and the gong was for their breakfast, and I can creep in and see them while they're at breakfast." Just as the last of the men in the black cloaks passed under the portico, there came a loud hissing noise, something between a whistle and an escape of steam from somewhere up in the air. The laurel was rather in the way of Kay getting a good view, but he saw the men in black look up towards the noise and looked up himself. To his amazement, he saw a silver aeroplane posing like a kestrel above the house. It had come noiselessly, and there it was, hovering in a way that Kay hadn't thought to be possible for an aeroplane. And the whistle, or hiss of steam, was plainly a signal, for a moment later the aeroplane sank slowly down vertically, as though into the very body of the house. "I say," Kay thought, "whoever would have thought that an aeroplane could do that?" He thought to himself at once, "Well, I suppose that's the kind of aeroplane that scrobbled Maria. And of course, if they got a thing like that, they could do all sorts of things that nobody would suspect. Now I wonder," he said, "if poor old Cole Hawlings and the bishop, and perhaps Caroline Louisa, are shut up in dungeons only a few yards away." Almost at once, as he listened, he heard a lot of men's voices singing together a familiar hymn. "Well, I don't know," he thought. "That sounds like a missionary college, but what would they want with Abner Brown? And what would they be doing with an aeroplane like that, if they were only missionaries?" However, it was now time to start back towards Peter. As he crossed above the tumbled rocks, he looked again, hoping to see some opening among them. This time he saw what he ought to have noticed before, a sluice with its winch, beside which was a rusty iron grating, so covered with drift of different sort that could not easily be distinguished. The water seeped and trickled through the grating, and fell, as he judged, some little distance. "I would like to go down there on a rope," Kay thought, "with torches and explore." At this moment the bell above the missionary college struck 9 and chimed the hour. Kay hurried to the agreed place where Peter was to be, but Peter was not there. Kay looked in the thickest cover, nearest to the agreed place, but there was still no sign of Peter. He certainly had not entered the cover there. Kay waited some minutes, thinking, well, Peter always was an ass. He never had much sense of time, and would always go wandering on and blundering into something. He waited a few more minutes, but Peter had not come. Then Kay thought, well, perhaps if he has gone on by himself, he will have left a pattern. He had often played gypsies with Peter, and he had read in one of George Borrow's books that gypsies put what they called a patteran, some sign or mark of leaves or twisted grass on the ground to show the direction they had taken. The agreed sign between Peter and himself was a handful of leaves, squeezed and dropped on the ground. He looked at the paths for such a mark, but could find none. "Oh, where has he gone?" he thought. Then he wondered, well, what should I have done if I'd have been in Peter's place? He had gone on, probably, past the little bathing box, and would have kept on the furthest side of the bathing box while the men were bathing. But what on earth would he have done then? He followed along the path by which he thought Peter might have gone on his exploration. Presently a little brook ran across the path. In the mud by the brook's bank was a mark of Peter's shoe. He did come as far as this, Kay thought, and he hasn't come back this way. Well, of course, he wouldn't come back this way. It was the maxim of these young scouts never to come back the way which they went in a strange or dangerous country. Presently the ground began to get very soft. A good many springs broke out there, and the channels by which they had fallen into the lake had been allowed to become choked. Peter's tracks were plain indeed. On the farther side of the soft patch, the track turned a corner, and there, to Kay's horror, were other tracks. 2 or 3 men had been there, and they were a little fresh, unmistakable signs of rapid trampling and scuffling. There's no doubt about it, Kay thought. They've scrobbled Peter. Someone's been here, and they've got Peter, just like that, silly ass, to go right into the lion's den. But if they scrobbled Peter, what did they do with him? Where did they take him? They didn't take him to the house at any rate. They took him away from the house. He reckoned up the chances and decided that it would be safe to follow after these people, whoever they were. They had got Peter and were removing him. The chances are that they would not be expecting anybody else, and it would be safe to follow in that direction. He had not gone far before he heard the noise of oars on the lake. Going down towards the water, and peering through the branches, he saw that a boat was pulling towards the mansion on the other side of the lake. In the stern sheets of the boat was something that looked like a roll of blanket. That's Peter, scrobbled, Kay thought. 2 sinister-looking men in the black coats were at the oars. 2 sinister-looking men were sitting in the stern sheets beside the bundle. One of them was steering, and the other was trailing for pike. They've got Peter all right, Kay thought. Then he wondered, should I go to the village of Hope-under-Chester and rouse the police there? Then he thought, no, the policeman is probably one of the gang, and I should be arrested for trespassing. I'll get back home and speak to the inspector, and perhaps by that time there'll be a word from Caroline Louisa.